The trial of Jesus continues. Let's take a look. All right, welcome back to 2:15. John chapter 19 is where we find ourselves today. This is actually the 21st episode in our Gospel of John series. If you haven't seen any of the previous episodes, I'll leave a link in the description and you can go there to check out a playlist of them and then come back here and we'll get started. So John chapter 19, it picks up right where chapter 18 ended. After having been betrayed by Judas, the trial of Jesus is underway as he has been interrogated by Annas, Caiaphas, and now Pilate as well. At the very end of chapter 18, Pilate offered the crowds gathered outside of the praetorium the opportunity to have Jesus released, only for them to call for a robber, Barabbas, to be released instead. All of that said, the trial continues, leading to Jesus' crucifixion. Verse 1, let's pick it up. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and to give him slaps in the face. The text states that they scourged Jesus. This would have been no ordinary flogging, but it would have been particularly brutal. In fact, it wasn't unheard of for Roman scourging to result in death before the individual ever even made it to the actual crucifixion. Scourging held multiple use cases in Roman practice. It was often used as punishment for prisoners who had committed crimes, a method of torture to draw out confessions, and it was also, much as it will be with the case for Jesus, used to weaken its victim to reduce their ability to resist during the crucifixion process. Roman scourging, it involved not only physical torture, but also elements of embarrassment as well. Individuals were stripped naked, tied to a post, and struck repeatedly with a whip, all while also being mocked mercilessly by their tormentors. The particular whip that in question, it would have had multiple cords, each embedded with bone, metal, and other materials, all intended to not only lacerate the individual, but to tear from the back, legs, arms, and anything else that came into contact with the torturous instrument until the victim's flesh literally hung in shreds around them. The aforementioned mocking, it took on a new sense in this case, as we see in the text. The Roman soldiers dressed Jesus in a purple robe, and they manufactured a crown made of thorns, placing it upon his head. Purple, it was a color that was commonly associated with royalty, and purple fabric especially proved to be costly to manufacture. Thus, it was often reserved for the more affluent members of society. Here, however, it was intended in a sarcastic and even blasphemous manner as they mocked the kingship of Jesus. The crown of thorns, however, it bore a different meaning and purpose than perhaps even these Roman soldiers realized. From the perspective of the guards, as Jesus was being struck, it would press the thorns into the scalp of Jesus, undoubtedly furthering his agony. The crown, however, unbeknownst to Jesus' tormentors, it further revealed Jesus as the one to set creation free from the curse of sin. In Genesis chapter 3, God, speaking to Adam, explains the curse that was now on the ground, causing it to produce thorns and thistles. We can take a look at this in Genesis chapter 3, beginning in verse 17. Then to Adam he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, 'You shall not eat from it,' cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your lives. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Just as Jesus bore the crown of thorns that was placed upon him, in turn, he was also bearing sin and its result, the curse of all creation, in order to fulfill its redemption. This all was the glory of which Jesus had spoken of on numerous occasions, not to be crowned in the riches of this world, but to bear our very curse upon himself and to set us free. As another fascinating parallel, the Greek term used to describe this crown, it would have been much akin to a wreath of victory given to winners of the ancient Greek Olympic Games. In the same way, though, Jesus, he would appear to be dying in defeat, would truly be triumphing over sin. Furthermore, he would also be truly victorious over death itself in his soon coming resurrection. As all of this was placed upon Jesus, as the text states, the guards continued to taunt him with calls of, "Hail, King of the Jews." And this also served as a sort of taunt to the Jews by extension. In a way, they taunted the idea of this being the best king that they had to offer. In some ways, this offers us an opportunity of reflection. These Romans were crowning Jesus, calling out his kingship. The Gospel of Matthew even mentions that they gave him a scepter made of a reed and bowed themselves before him. All things that, if done in sincerity, truly crowning Jesus King of Kings, bowing ourselves before him, would be the proper response of the heart. And yet, in their insincerity, they mock him. So the question comes to us as we look at our lives: do our words and our actions, the praise, worship, and glory that we offer to the Lord, come from a place of sincerity in our lives? Are we offering him the best that we have to give, crowning him the king of our entire selves? Or are we mocking him in insincerity with false or even hollow worship, unwilling to give ourselves completely to him? Verse 4. Pilate came out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Jesus then came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God." In many ways, this serves as yet another attempt by Pilate to try to goad the Jews into releasing Jesus rather than killing him. From his statement of, "I find no guilt in him," we see that he saw no reason in Jesus worthy of death, at least from a Roman perspective, and quite possibly was hoping to satisfy the Jews' bloodlust by beating Jesus and then displaying him in his wounded state before the crowd. This, however, proved to not be enough to satisfy the crowd, and they began to cry out yet again for him to be crucified. Pilate, once again, wishing to wash his hands of the situation, however, tells the Jews to take him and crucify him themselves, because he found no guilt in him and thus was unwilling to carry out the punishment himself. This, however, was an impossible statement within the restrictions that the Romans had placed on the Jews. They were not allowed to carry out capital punishment by Roman law. In essence, Pilate is stating, "I see nothing wrong in what he has said or done, nothing worthy of a Roman execution. If you feel that he is so worthy of death, break Roman law and carry out the punishment yourselves." The Jews, however, they pressed the issue further, accusing Jesus of blasphemy by claiming to be the Son of God. This, however, serves to disturb Pilate even further. Verse 8. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid, and he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Up to this point, Pilate believed Jesus had only claimed to be king. To claim to be the Son of God was an entirely different story, leading to further questioning. Pilate asks him, "Where are you from?" However, Jesus, having already given him the answer to his question by stating that he was the king of a kingdom that was not of this world, refuses to answer. This leads Pilate to question him further, pointing out that in a physical sense, he held the authority to release or to crucify him. Jesus, however, wasn't interested in being released in the slightest. He knew what he must endure and why he must endure it. He was unwilling to turn back even in the face of the agony he was enduring and would soon endure even more. He responds, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Pilate believed himself empowered by Rome to truly be in control of whether Jesus lived or died. In reality, Pilate only had power that was granted to him, and it wasn't granted to him by Rome. It was granted to him by God. Jesus and all of his godhood was not reliant on Pilate to set him free. He could have easily released himself and walked free at any time that he so desired. However, much as he has been from the very beginning of this gospel account, Jesus was mission-minded, and he was focused on fulfilling what the Father had given him to accomplish. The text states that Pilate made even further efforts to have Jesus released. Undoubtedly, Jesus was unlike any other prisoner he had encountered to date. He believed him to be innocent, and he desired for him to be set free. At the same time, he also had a tremendous political juggling act to keep up, desiring to keep from angering the crowd to such a degree as to cause a riot or a rebellion. This is further exemplified by the last threat of the Jews: "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar." Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. Some historical accounts point out that Pilate was only placed in his position of authority because of his relationship to Caesar. That is, apparently he was married to the emperor's granddaughter. So one can easily imagine the implications of such a challenge, that releasing Jesus would place Pilate in direct opposition to Caesar himself. And clearly Pilate viewed this position that he was in and the reason for it being there as fragile. With all this in mind, the Jews pressed on this place of weakness in Pilate, as Pilate finally relents. Verse 13. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." With the Passover looming, along with all of its prophetic implications, Pilate called out for one final confirmation as he sat in the Gabbatha, or the elevated place, as the Hebrew is translated. He asked the Jews one final time if he should crucify their king. They respond in the affirmative, declaring allegiance to the very regime in which they hated and toiled under, the same regime in which they sought, through their idea of the Messiah, to be liberated from, crying out, "We have no king but Caesar." With that, once and for all, Jesus was rejected by his own people. Even just in the midst of this trial, they have declared him to be worse than a robber, declared him to be a blasphemer, called for his death repetitively, and aligned themselves not with God, but with Caesar. The Jews were given every evidence necessary and were the ones who should have known him, identified him, accepted him, and embraced him, their Messiah. And while it would be so easy to point fingers at them and to look down on them through the lens of history, we see also another opportunity here for self-examination. We, through God's word, Jesus' death on the cross, his resurrection, and the offer of the Holy Spirit to dwell within those who believe upon Jesus, have been given every evidence necessary, every tool needed to be reconciled to the Father and to live as God has called us to live. The question becomes, what do we choose? Do we choose to seek after the glory of the world, crying out in rejection of our Messiah, Jesus Christ, aligning ourselves with the same regime of darkness that has plagued and oppressed all of humanity for generations? Do we cry out, crucify him, along with the world? Or instead, do we embrace him, seek after him, and surrender our lives wholly and completely to him so that he can purify us, change us, and make us to be more like him and to reconcile us in relationship to the Father? This is a great place for us to stop. And next time we'll be continuing in John chapter 19. Jesus is crucified in the rest of this passage. The Creator himself put to death by his own creation so that he might make a way for us to be redeemed. Please consider subscribing to stay up to date as new studies are released. And I pray that all of this is beneficial for you and helps you strengthen your walk with the Lord. Thanks for watching.